Please welcome Marissa. Our moderator today, it is David Eckoff. David is Vice President, New Product Development and Innovation at Turner Broadcasting. He is responsible for overseeing the development, evaluation, and launch of new products across the Turner Entertainment, News, and Animation divisions. Previously, David was Senior Director at Reel Networks. While at Reel, he led breakout hits such as CBS Big Brother 24/7. He invented the first of its kind online digital media marketplace and developed live online sports broadcasts. He holds an MBA from the University of North Carolina and publishes a personal blog on innovation and new media at www.davideckoff.com. So with that, please join David, or please welcome David. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I'm David Eckoff, and it's an honor to be here today with Marissa Mayer, VP at Google. And the format today, we've got about 90 minutes. We're going to spend some of that time with the conversation, talking about new product development, talking about the business of Turner, where Marissa sees things going on in the industry, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A from the audience, at least 30 minutes for Q&A. So think of lots of questions, hold your questions for the Q&A portion, there'll be lots of time for that. So to kick things off, let's go behind the scenes, Marissa, at Google. How do you develop new products? How do you describe the end-to-end process from idea through launch and everything in between?
First, let me just say I'm really excited and happy to be here. This is my first time in Atlanta. I've been in Georgia before, but never in Atlanta. I barely make it out of the airport, so I'm excited to be taking in the city. The product question is actually a really broad question because every product has its own genesis. But basically, we gather ideas from all over the company. Some of the ideas are top-down. They're us realizing that we have strategic holes in what we're offering our end users. A lot of the ideas are actually bottoms-up. Engineers and other employees coming up with ideas and prototypes of what they want to build. But from there are definitely phases of a product. So, for example, a prototype at Google is worth 100,000 words. There's one thing to talk to someone about an idea, it's a whole other thing to be able to show us a series of mock-ups or sort of functioning website that actually illustrates your idea. And from that moment of having that prototype on, what we generally do is try and put a small team, and sometimes even volunteer efforts, with what we call 20% time. 20% time is a notion we have at Google that we want employees to work on whatever they want to work on, regardless of whether or not it's their core assignment, for about 20% of their time. So some of the times the prototype is developed voluntarily, sometimes it's developed by a small team, but generally it's a couple individuals who develop the prototype, and then we launch it. We try and send it out to Google Labs as quickly as we can. We try and launch early and often, and then change the product and iterate it based on user feedback, adding more resources as something gains strength and popularity.
Well, thank you. One of the core tenets that you have, and you talked briefly about, is ideas come from everywhere. And you mentioned earlier, Google expects everyone to innovate, even the finance team, even the legal team. It's not just one innovation department and that's it. Can you give some examples of innovation from other areas of the company?
Sure. So we do, Google prides itself on being very innovative. Our two founders, Larry and Sergey, the easiest way for me to describe them to people so they understand sort of the mindset is that they're quintessential Montessori kids. Do you guys all know, who knows what Montessori is? So it's like the preschool where you sort of let kids do what they want to do when they want to do it, and teach them to challenge authority and ask lots of questions. So a lot of times Larry and Sergey will say, why are we doing this way or that way? And so as a result, we really pride ourselves on being innovative, and we have what I would actually call innovation envy across the company, whereby which yes, the engineers and product managers are working on trying to create new and innovative products for us to release to the public, but there's innovation that we see all over the organization. So things like our IPO process was probably as different of a public offering process as anyone had ever seen. Doing a Dutch auction with lots of different banks involved. And so that was sort of our finance and our legal team innovating. Our HR team does a lot of innovation in terms of approaching new benefits. So we have free food on campus, we have a dog policy, we have laundry machines on campus with a very elaborate timer system designed by our engineers about when to go and switch your laundry from washer to dryer to make sure we're using it all efficiently. And you know, even things like our food service really prides themselves on innovating. My boss, Jonathan, likes to tell the story of our omelet station in the morning, because we actually serve 3 meals a day on campus, including breakfast. And usually when you go to an omelet station, you'll say, I'd like some cheese in my omelet, I'd like some eggs, I'd like some onions and mushrooms. And what you actually do at the Google omelet station is they just have all the toppings out, and you grab a bowl, and you put all your toppings in the bowl, and then hand the bowl to the chef. And they make an omelet out of that. And we realized one morning, like, that was a really interesting innovation in our food service. There's been another innovation that no one really understands lately, which is that there seem to be signs on the outside of each of the conference room doors about tea service. Whether or not you want tea service in the middle of the afternoon. And again, I think it's sort of this innovation envy that the chefs and the food service crew just want to do something differently. So they've been coming around with tea and cookies, and you can put a red stop sign or a green light on the outside of your conference door as to whether or not you want the cookies or the tea between 2 and 4. So we have a lot of fun, and people really do like to innovate all throughout the culture. And I think that by having a really immersive, creative experience where everyone around you is trying to examine what they do every day and trying to think of a different and new way to approach something, it really does fuel a lot of innovation. I do think there is real merit to creativity for creativity's sake.
You talked about the 20% time, and Google's legendary for the 20% time. So you take maybe like 1 day out of the week and do that which you care most about. You've got passion. You empower employees to do that. What kind of return on that kind of investment of time do you see? How exactly does that work?
Sure. So, I mean, I should mention that we call it 20% time. But I really think of it more as, that's sort of our slogan that provides our employees with a creative license to know that they're empowered to spend 20% of their time doing whatever it is they feel most passionately about. Because we really think that it's that kind of passion that creates really great and beautiful products. And we want people to know that we hire the really bright people and try and provide them great systems of computing and access to other great people to build wonderful things. And so 20% time isn't every Friday is Innovation Day, and it's not 5 to 7 is the innovation hours of the day. For each person, they institute 20% time different ways, right? So some people will do it a couple of hours each day. Some people will do it 1 day a week. Some people will do it 1 month out of every 5 months. They'll go to their boss and say, I've been working really hard on my core project, and now I'd like to take some time for myself. And interestingly, there's a bunch of people who are actually completely fired up about the projects they're working on, which is my case. People often ask me, if I have 20% time, and the answer is that I do. But for me, it's that's the 20% of my time that I segment towards the new projects that are just getting started, where I feel really compelled to give a lot of direction and insight. And so people structure their 20% time in different ways. But at the end of the day, it really is about building something that you think will be particularly powerful. What we found is that often supports the core, and it actually gives a sort of disproportionate return on investment. So someone asked me once to try and quantify the outputs of 20% time. So I looked over our launch calendar, which has all of our historical launches, for a 6-month period, tagging where different ideas came from. And we realized that over that 6-month period, 50% of the products and features that had launched came from 20% time. So it was disproportionate by a factor of about 2.5 in terms of how much energy and output and product we were seeing from that time. And it really does mean that for us it's very worthwhile.
I think it's interesting how you said you quantified that. One of the key tenets that you have for innovation that I read about is don't politic, use data. And I understand you discourage your team from, in meetings, saying, I like in meetings. Instead, you're pushing your staffers to look at metrics. How do you build that type of culture within the company?
I think that overall, Google, it grew out of a very academic culture. Larry and Sergey had left their PhD programs, and so it is, in fact, very data-driven. And everything, people will come and observe us, and they'll make the observation that Google, overall, for a company its size, doesn't have the same kind of political feel that a lot of other companies and/or departments have. And when I look at various examples, it's things like the user interface design process, which I'm really involved in. And a lot of companies degenerates to, do you like this screen better than that screen? Do you like top navigation better than side navigation? Who is better friends and better buddies outside of work with the manager or the decision maker? And at Google, the decisions just don't get made that way. We actually look at a core set of metrics around search volume and overall ads RPM, which is revenue per 1,000 pages. And we look at those metrics to try and make decisions. And so we'll decide, okay, for this particular test, in terms of which navigation is better or which color is better, this is the principal metric we're hoping to improve. And whoever's design improves that the most, that's ultimately the design that will launch. And so people really can feel confident that their design and or their idea will get chosen based on its merits. And I do think that's deployed all throughout the company, because even when I look at other things like the I like, yes, we deploy that in our user interface reviews, right? We'll try and have people break it down more to cognitive psychology principles, right? Like the foreground text and the background don't provide enough contrast for good readability. That's a statement, right? It may mean that you should brighten the background or darken the foreground, but the point is that that's a cognitive principle that we can govern by. That's just much more academic and data driven, but also on things like hiring. So we have hiring committees that meet, so whereby when you're interviewing at Google, you go through a series of somewhere on the order of 6 to 8 interviews, and each interviewer writes up their feedback. And when we're in the hiring committee will actually, they're different from the set of interviewers because we want to have an unbiased sample read the entire set of data. And in there, it's really important. I'll say, sometimes we'll occasionally have an interviewer in the room just as sort of as a one-off, and we'll say, this really should be about the feedback, right? The feedback says that this person is particularly strong in terms of analytical skills, or the feedback suggests this or that. So we try and phrase it in terms of the feedback, in terms of personal, rather than personal observation or personal preference.
You mentioned earlier that ideas from Google, they come from everywhere. Throughout the whole company, they're bottoms up, tops down, across the board. You have a lot of ideas coming inbound. And you're self-described as the gatekeeper. You're oftentimes having to say no to new ideas. I'm interested, how do you screen new ideas? What criteria do you use to evaluate new ideas? What processes do you follow? Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think that there definitely is sort of a vibe that comes from a winning idea. But when I try and break it down, there's a couple of key points. One is that usually when investing in a new product, I'll sort of think of it almost in terms of a new company, a new startup inside of Google, and try to understand how we should invest. And so a couple of criteria that I look at. One thing that I'll look at is there a core piece of technology that would be interesting and or repurposable in any number of ways? So for example, one of the businesses I green-lighted last year was 1-800-GOOG-411, which is a free 411 service. And it's not clear that free 411 is actually going to work. In terms of it's really expensive to actually process the calls and deal with that. And even though we're automating and driving down costs, it still may not pan out. But what is really interesting is by having all of these different people call 1-800-GOOG-411 and say various requests, we're actually building a database of phonemes that will make it possible for us to build a more robust speech-to-text model. And that speech-to-text model could be used in any number of ways. It could help us deploy phone-based search without, even outside of 411. It could help us deploy car-based computers. It could help us do things like take videos and generate closed caption transcripts off of them rather than having those be generated by humans. So there's all kinds of ways that core technology of speech-to-text could be repositioned. And so when I'm looking at a project, a lot of times I'll look for that nugget of technology that can be used in a lot of different ways. But I'll also look at things in terms of, is this the kind of product that's easily articulatable and will grow from word of mouth? Meaning it's a very simple concept that people can express to each other on the street. It's maps, and you can drag them and drop them, right? Which is sort of the concept behind Google Maps. Things like iGoogle. It's the Google homepage, plus you get to add your own stuff to it. Right? Like very basic concepts that will spread easily, that are easily understood, so people can sort of hear about it, go, search for it, find it, and use it because it's just sort of instantly intuitive. And then the third thing that I would look for is the overall vibe from the team. Because a lot of times when you look at sort of founding startups or founding teams, it really comes down to the verve and the tenacity of the team. Eric Schmidt, our CEO, and I were talking once, and I said once, Eric, gosh, like my area has become so broad that it's really hard for me to be an expert on everything that I'm hearing about. Like I can't even imagine looking over the whole company, right, across ads and apps and all these different pieces. And I said, like, what are you looking for? And he's like, sometimes it really comes down to the vibe in the room. He's like, I'll just sit there And he's like, when a really good team comes in, he's like, I just get this visual image in my head of someone trying to take the mountain. He's like, I literally will see the presenters and the people there, and I just feel like they're so fired up that in my head I just unconsciously get this image of that team really charging the mountain in the sense that like no one's going to be able to knock them back. And so that's really what you want. You want a piece of repurposable technology, a very easy and simple to understand idea, and you want a great founding team that's really fired up, so fired up that they won't take no for an answer, and they won't fail. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are entrepreneurs, and one of them made the observation, I said, how do you decide when to start a company, and when does that actual moment happen when you start a company? And I think the same thing is true when you start a project or start a team. And he said, the moment that you start a company is the moment when you won't take no for an answer. And that's true for projects too. There comes a moment when the people who are starting it become so convinced that the idea is a good idea that they just won't take no for an answer, and they're able, on some level, to argue down and articulate counter reasons to any possible argument. And that's really the moment things take flight, and that's the kind of fire that you're looking for.
What you talked about at lunchtime I found particularly interesting also, how you will purposely take a new product, put it in maybe arguably one of the worst places that no one's easily going to be able to find in Google Labs, and then you'll intentionally give that product a horrible name.
Yes.
Because it can survive the horrible name, and it can survive being in a bad place, then maybe it gets some traction.
Yeah, so it's true. So we do, I mean, I'll cut back to the launch early and often, and then I'll also cut back to this concept of staging different products across the site. But in product development, there's basically, in my view, two possible paths. There's castle building, and then there's launch early and often. What castle building means is you sort of have an idea, you pull the curtains closed, you work for a bunch of years, then you throw the curtains open, and you hope that there's a castle behind it. Right? And sometimes that works brilliantly. Like Apple, for example, is a company culture that castle builds phenomenally. And the great thing about castle building is when you do that, it does have like a worldwide wow effect. Right? But the bad part of castle building is if you built the wrong thing, or if you got off market or off target or off on a bad tangent, you're preparing yourself for a really big flop. And the beauty of launch early and often, the downside is that you never sort of get that wow effect. But the good thing about it is if you think of product development as sort of a vector, where the market is telling you where to go. The problem with castle building is if the product wants you to go here, you could go there and be 2 years down the road heading in that direction, not realizing that you really needed to course correct. Where if you're launching early and often, you never get very far off of the correct vector because you're launching and your users are telling you exactly what they want to see happen. How should they iterate the product? How should you get it back on track? And users are really powerful that way, but that ultimately helps us get to the place where the market wants us to be sooner. So, and the truth is, with a good product, it's hard to keep it down. So and it's launch early and often because a lot of times we're launching products that just aren't fully baked. Right? We launched Google News without sort by date. We launched Frugal, our product search, without sort by price. We launched Google Video and you couldn't actually watch the videos. You could just search closed caption transcripts. We made a couple of really horrible mistakes in launch early and often. But by staging it across the site, by basically taking those new products and putting them places where maybe only early adopters will find them, or a small segment of the population will find them, we can actually stage it. So for example, Google Maps launched on Google Labs, and it had the name search by location. Ideally, because we didn't want it to be a big breakout product with that first name, we wanted to basically get a couple of users using it, get some feedback, and then iterate it, and then slowly move it on to advanced search and place it different places until ultimately it reached the Google homepage in its final incarnation in terms of brand of Google Maps, and when we felt it was more polished. But user feedback is really powerful in the launch early and often process, and so I'll just offer one other anecdote, which, because of CNN, hopefully when people here will probably think is a little bit silly and shows how much we're computer scientists and not journalists. But when we were producing Google News, we were about to launch it, and we decided we didn't want to launch on a Thursday or Friday because that's kind of a bad time to launch, and also generally guarantees our engineers have to work through the weekends and do other things. And we had already kind of burned the team pretty hard, working a lot of weekends leading up to the launch. And so we decided we would launch the following Monday, which meant we had a couple of days of bugs, 1 or 2 days of bugs to fix up, and we had time to maybe put in one more feature. So there were 6 of us on the team, and the number 6 becomes really important in a minute. So when we had a meeting, we decided, okay, we have time to put in one more feature. What were the suggestions for features? And one of the suggestions was sort by date, allow someone to use the toggle and surface the freshest news. The other idea was search by location. And we didn't know, would people want the freshest news or would they want the stuff closest to them? Which would be more important in Google News? And probably to all of you, this isn't entirely obvious, but we couldn't figure it out, and the team split 3-3. So we ended up in this incessant, insipid argument where like 3 people wanted to do search by location, 3 people wanted to do sort by date, and we just couldn't work it out at all. And so finally I, as the product manager, just had to say, okay guys, all right, forget it, we can't sort it out. You know, let's just take it easy, fix up the bugs ever that much more. Let's not try and stuff one more feature in. We'll launch on Monday and we'll see what the users say. And of course, we launched the product on Monday, and by noon on Monday, we had 300 emails asking for sort by date, and 3 asking for search by location. Right? So the users like answered the debate. I mean, like we thought it was 50-50, and it turns out no, it's like 100-1. And so you know that makes it really, really clear, and it's that kind of feedback that makes the early and often strategy really work and allows this staged approach to do a small launch on labs, then move it to advanced search to make it a little bit more stream, you know, keep it in beta, move it to the home page, right? Like rebrand it and change its name to a more and more polished name as you go. That really makes that work because then people can respect each iteration and more users find it as you move along.
You mentioned Apple before, and I understand that you admire Steve Jobs and how Apple does product development. How do you go about studying and modeling Apple? What approach do you take? And what are some of the most important things you've learned through that process?
Sure. Well, one of the things I do on the side of the search product business is I run an associates program where I hire people right out of school with computer science, bachelor's and master's degrees, and teach them how to be good product managers in the Google sense. And part of being a good product manager is learning how to think and talk about and launch your products. And so we do a series of field trips throughout the year, but one of the field trips that we do is to Steve Jobs' Macworld keynote in January, where he unveils a lot of the products for that half of the year. And it's really interesting because it almost is like a football coach watching the opposing team, then trying to sit down with the players and break it down to X's and O's, where we'll go and we'll watch the keynote, and we take a bus up to San Francisco, and we take a bus back down. And on the bus back down, we'll actually sit down and break down, like, you know, how did he talk about this? How did he talk about that? What worked about this or that? You know, what was clever about it? And, you know, just a lot of different insights have come out of that in terms of what can help build excitement about a product, what can help build understanding about a product. It was sort of funny. At one point, we realized that Jobs was so mesmerizing that at one point when he was bringing out these new laptops, he talked about performance per watt. Per watt, because basically one of the big things that holds laptops back is how much energy can be generated from the battery at any given moment. How many watts can it have, and how much productivity can you get out of your computer using those watts. And that's one thing that's held it back. And so he's talking about the fact that the Intel processor, when introduced into Macs, got a lot more performance per watt. And I remember he had all these great graphs that showed bar graphs of like, what a performance per watt used to be here, what a performance per watt is now, twice as much. With no real X or Y axis. But the thing is, he was so mesmerizing that, I'm sitting there, it wasn't until we got on the bus, right? So, he had mentioned this measurement and talked about it for 5 minutes. About half an hour before the end of his speech, we all got on the bus, and it wasn't until about 5 minutes into the bus ride and realized this is an entire bus full of computer scientists, educated at the world's best schools, when suddenly someone said, what is performance per watt? That's not a computer science metric. What is performance? Is it flops? Is it operations per second? What is it, right? What exactly was he talking about? And we realized that he was so good at breaking down the concept and making it so generally understandable, the idea that your computer is just faster and more efficient with this new processor in it, that we actually didn't even notice that he was trying to speak in what probably to a layperson sounded like these really complicated computer science terms that were so graspable, but actually wasn't computer science at all. And so we'll break down things like that, and there's a lot of interesting insights the team has had into the way that he talks about products and how he makes really complicated principles, like what the Intel processor can do for laptops, easily understandable.
Are there any other companies that you look at, that you study, that you try to model, and you think do a really great job with innovation and new product development?
Sure. there are a lot of them. I think that when you look out broadly at the industry, I really think that 3M is a great company where it's clear that they do a lot to incent new innovation and ideas. We look a lot at startups And it's interesting, even as we do acquisitions and we learn more about their internal operating procedures, we'll find out things like, YouTube, one of the reasons they did so well with end users is they were just iterating so fast. So that user feedback loop that I talked about was really, really fast and intense at YouTube because they decided that they were going to launch new features every week. So every week they would push a new release to the site, and every week they would have new features. So they constantly had to be studying what were their users asking for, what did they want them to do next, and every week the site would change, which makes the site a really exciting and interesting place to be because every week we can go there and do something new and it becomes a richer and richer feature set. So there certainly are interesting observations like that. A lot of times that come off out of startups in terms of how people are incented, how they guarantee a fast innovation cycle.
And you mentioned 3M. They obviously have a strong culture, and that contributes to innovation. I've had a chance to spend some time on the Google campus, and unquestionably there are some really special things happening in terms of the campus, the culture. Can you talk a little bit about how the cultural attributes at Google and how they contribute to innovation?
Well, as I said, I do think there's a stream of innovation and envy where people like to question the status quo. They like to think about doing things in new, audacious is the word we often talk about, in new audacious ways, right? If the standard thing in the industry is to give away 4 to 6 megabytes of mail space, let's not make it 20 megabytes of space. Let's give them a gig, right? So really trying to have big and audacious goals for how to do something and how to approach new problems. Larry and Sergey will talk about, as we start off, new ideas in the company. We really want a new idea to basically have $1 billion revenue run rate opportunity. And that doesn't mean that we think about monetization all the time. What we really think about are the end users and what they ultimately want. But we want them to be big opportunities, things that really matter to people, things that they'll use every day. Because we think when you work on really big, important problems that matter and are fundamentally useful to people's everyday lives, you'll find a way to monetize it. Because either it will be so valuable that users themselves will pay for it subscription-wise, and or there will be a way of advertising. It's much like actually the television and cable businesses, where once you have something that's really valuable that users want, there's any number of combinations, subscription and advertising-wise, you can put together a good monetization platform.
Well, Google has added over 2,100 employees. In fact, it's like 2,130 just last quarter alone, and that's to a base of 16,000. So that's amazing growth for a number of employees. How do you maintain the culture of the company with that type of employee growth?
Sure. So, from my perspective, I started at Google when there were about 18 people. And now there's about 18,000. So I've literally watched the company scale 1,000 times over. And I think that we were really lucky when we were small, and that the people that we hired were all very like-minded. They were all interested in working on problems that really mattered. They all wanted to do good things for the world. They wanted to work on problems and projects that their friends and their family would use every day. And so as a result, we had a very stable culture and growth through those early periods. And then I started realizing something around 1,200 employees. And because I would, as new hires come, you make small talk with them. Where did you come from? Did you have to move? Did you find an apartment? What drew you to Google? And I remember for the first time at about 1,200 employees, I got this interesting answer I'd never gotten before, which was the culture. And I just thought, that's such an odd answer, and it's such an odd reason to go to a company, because like me graduating from school and deciding to go to Google, right? It was about I think I'm going to be working on really interesting problems involving artificial intelligence, the way it gets applied to search, right? And it was that intellectual challenge that drew me to Google. And so going somewhere for the culture just seemed like a really odd answer, but then I started hearing that answer all the time. And I noticed that from about 1,200 employees to about 1,500 employees, almost every new person that I talked to, or 50% of the new people I talked to, started citing the culture. And then I realized that the culture was actually having this very interesting reinforcing effect, where once you actually, there's the point of maintaining stability up to 1,200 employees, but then once we hit 1,200 employees, the culture became very self-reinforcing, because when you have the majority of your employees joining a company for the culture, the last thing those employees want to do when they arrive is change it or screw it up. Right? They came there to experience it, to participate in it, to benefit from it. And so, as a result, the culture has become really, really stable since. And I think there's just really, people ask me a lot about what's sort of stunning over watching that kind of growth. And I actually think that one of the most stunning things is how like-minded and similarly motivated the early Googlers are to today's Googlers. So when we were really small, we were a mess of a company. I don't know if you know how search engines work, but the way it works is we basically, at the time, now we do it continuously refreshing. But what we basically do is about once a month, we would go and gather up a copy of the web. We'd go and get one page, stanford.edu, then go to all the links on it, get those pages, bring back copies of them, go and get the links from those pages, bring back copies of them. And basically, what you do is you assemble a web book. And we would literally get the web pages, number them up, and then the process of building a search engine is building the index in the back of the book to say the word cat appears on page 8, 13, 17, except they're not numbers, they're URLs. And what a search engine really explores, and all search engines do, is the ability to take those index lists, in the industry they're called postings lists, and combine them in interesting ways. So for example, when we do a search for cat food, we get the list for cat, we find all the pages that have the word cat on it, we pull the list of all the pages that have the word food on it, we do an intersection, because those are all the pages that have both the word cat and food on them, and then we do a series of rankings looking at are the words close together? Are they in bold? Are they in the title? Are they in the top of the page? You know, how many times do they appear in the page to sort of do that analysis? So that's how a search engine works. And we would run this collection process to build the web book. It's called the crawl, or the spider, once a month. And there was a guy named Harry, who was our 5th employee, who ran the crawler. And Harry, like on his business card, actually had the title of Spider-Man, because his problem was a spider. And we were a mess. Because like Harry running the spider basically meant for a series of 10 days, Harry would sit at his computer and type in sequence about 500 commands at the command line prompt on the Linux box, right? And if Harry made a mistake, I mean, we were so much of a mess of a company that if Harry made a mistake on line 238, there was no backing up to 237 or 200. It was just like, oh, start over, right? Like, later we learned, to checkpoint and have a lot of failures and fallbacks. So the process of running the crawl basically was the process of Harry making sure that Harry's morale was high and that he was well caffeinated. So when Harry was running the crawler, we were always like working round the clock as the early days of the startup. It's brutal, and we would all hang around in the office till 2, 3 in the morning. And of course, by around 3 in the morning, all the programming is stopped and it's degenerated into conversation. So we'd all be sitting out around the door outside of Harry's office while he sat there, tensely waiting to type the next command, and we all made sure that he was doing okay, had enough caffeine, and chatting about what Google could do. And one of these late night sessions, we're all sitting around. Our offices really has always been sort of quirky in its setup. So we had bean bags and exercise balls. So we're all sitting around on large, round, colorful objects, kind of bouncing around, talking about what Google could do. And I remember that conversation so vividly because in that conversation was the first time we thought about Google Book Search. Could we scan all the books in the world using high-resolution photography and then use optical character recognition to pull the text off and make it searchable? We talked about the fact that we thought we would ultimately need to have a client-side presence that would live in the browser and give people direct access to search from the Chrome, which of course ultimately became Google Toolbar. And now if you look at IE and Firefox, they all have search boxes in the Chrome. We were all sitting there saying, we think this is inevitable. We think that browsers will have boxes in the Chrome. And we talked about all of that night. And interestingly, in the middle of it, George Herrick, who is one of my favorite early Googlers and a really good friend, he's this short Lebanese guy with really long arms. I remember that because he jumped off of his yellow exercise ball into the middle of the circle. And with his big arms, like we always did caricatures of George with his long arms. And he said, I want everyone to just stop. And he's like, I just want everyone to stop and savor this moment. Because whatever happens from here on out, it'll never be as good as it is right now. And we all just stopped and took in the moment. We were like, wow, like there have been just like a huge number of big ideas tonight. And Harry hasn't made any mistakes on the crawl. Like life is good, right? Like this is just a really good moment. And I think it's so funny about it because we did all sort of stop and think that there's some inherent truth in what George said in that moment. But I also think it's funny because George is brilliant, but it's one of the most incorrect statements he's ever made. And not because, I mean, yes, the traffic is great, the revenue is great, right? Like there's a lot of things that have been really good about Google. But what makes me really proud, and when I think about that conversation, is I had an MP3 recorder sitting on my desk, and I wish I had grabbed it and taped that conversation. Because if I did, I could tape the same conversations that happen every night around the pool table at Google, or around the foosball table, or in the snack kitchens. And you hear that same kind of language, that kind of aspirational language of what could Google do, right? You know, what would be possible? You know, what's interesting in technology, and how can we combine that with some of the infrastructure we're building, and what would be sort of a big and audacious goal in this area? And that same conversation happens every night. And if I played those two conversations for you, not knowing the voices, you actually probably couldn't tell them apart in terms of which one was the early conversation and which one was the conversation. I think that's a huge tribute to Google and the culture in terms of the fact that the people who come now still are inspired and motivated by the very same principles that we have from early on.
That's awesome. You know, I've got this very vivid mental image of people sitting around in the beanbag chairs and exercise balls. And we talked earlier, if you were to go to work at a business that's more mature in its life cycle, perhaps, maybe something like an airline or a cable network or a widget factory, how would you bring in, what would be your approach to innovation and new product development at a company like that? How might it be different? You mentioned the term leapfrogging earlier.
Sure, so I think there's a couple of things that transcend. I mean, the answer is a lot of things that are special at Google and work at Google. But I think there's a couple of things that transcend. So I think 20% time, basically letting your employees know that you trust them and that they're empowered enough to work on the things that they think could have the biggest impact on the business, or they think may be most impactful for the world, is a really important and interesting idea. And I think that works largely everywhere. I also think that there's sort of key elements that we look at in terms of just overall metrics and trends that you actually want to sort of coach the internal organizational structure towards. And one of them is small teams. So when I joined Google, there were 9 engineers, and we were organized in 3 teams of 3. And we knew that we were going to add 9 more engineers by year's end, so there'd be 18 of us. And Larry and Sergey said, you know what? By year's end, we don't want to have 3 teams of 6. We want to have 6 teams of 3. Let's keep the core team at the size 3, because if we have twice as many engineers, we don't want to be doing all the same things twice as well. We want to be doing twice as many things. So, you know, there's a conscious decision to sacrifice some element of quality and polish for the sake of doing more things and having more of a breadth of different efforts going on. And the other nice benefit this has is it keeps the culture much more entrepreneurial and much more motivated, because when you're working in a smaller team, you have a much greater sense of ownership. You aren't sitting there in a team where you're like, you know what, if I don't do X today, someone else will pick up the slack, or it can wait for tomorrow, because either it's important enough for one of the 3 of you to do it, or it's not, right? And so I think by creating a culture that has those small teams, that's something that, you know, that is true in startups, it's true in large companies, that by coaching these small teams, you're much more likely to get innovation, because people start to do the necessary in order to get more, you know, user base, they get a larger user base, get more funding, get more resources, and that ultimately really guides people to you know, to a more innovative place. And then there's also the concept of leapfrogging. So we've noticed, as Google's matured as a company, there's of course now some teams that while they might be structured in smaller teams within them, they're large teams. Like our search team is a behemoth team. Like we actually have like more people working on search right now than we ever have in the past. Like, you know, I think, you know, it depends on how you count it, but literally hundreds of people, if not more than 1,000 people working on search. And it's the same is true for ads. And what we've noticed is there, when you add a small sort of disruptor team that's supposed to think about things in a new and different way, 2 bad things happen. One, the large, experienced, mature team wants to talk to the disruptor team and say, look, I know that seems like a good idea, because it seemed like a good idea to us too. But, you know, we tried it, and it was a waste of a year. So like, please, don't bother to do that. Just skip that idea and move on to the next thing. Right? So they're trying to influence what the disruptor team does. And the other thing that happens is usually that big team is actually really successful, and they have a bunch of infrastructure and tools and things that really work that the disruptor team kind of wants to draft off of. They want to kind of help and support it, build on the platform. And so as a result, it's very hard in like a large company with a big successful team for a disruptor team not to get sort of sucked in to the larger team over time. So what we started doing is, as we've rolled out leapfrog initiatives, we put them in, we structure them organizationally and from a communication standpoint where they're sort of out of touch with the core team. They're in a different reporting structure. They report through a different engineering VP, or they're and also physically diverse, right? So And we have a bunch of different attempts at leapfrogs that have been kicked off recently. There's one in search. And so there's a team in Kirkland that's working on trying to build a better search engine than Google itself. And I'm not allowed to talk to them. And that's probably a good thing, because you know what? I know they're wasting time. Like, I know they're doing things that we did that we know just don't work. And I would love to talk to them, and I would love to save them that effort. But the point is, but my very action of doing that would ultimately change their outcome and change how disruptive they can be. So it's really important that I not talk to the Kirkland Search Leapfrog and Shiva and his engineers and let them do their own thing. And who knows, maybe they'll build a better search engine, but we do think with a few years under their belt, they will have different features, different ideas that maybe could stand on their own and actually be stronger than Google itself, or maybe should be folded into the main search engines after they've reached a level of maturity and have sort of proven their value. And we have similar efforts in maps, in advertising, and it's important to have those leapfrogs. And so we've noticed that it is, and again, you want to keep a small team, but you also want a disruptor to be far enough away that they don't get overly influenced and or voluntarily pulled in to the larger, more successful team.
We talked earlier about the business of television. I'm interested from the audience. Who uses TiVo or PVR? Say aye. Aye. So a lot of people. Who uses something like YouTube on a regular basis? Say aye. Aye. So like just about everyone in the room. So Marissa, you told me before that TiVo and YouTube you view as harbingers of what could what could come in television. How do you see the business of television changing over time? What's Google's vision for the business of television?
Sure. So I'll draw an analogy from a dinner I had with a friend about a year ago now. So I had this friend who was doing a PhD in biology, and we went to dinner. She told me all about her PhD thesis, where she had found an interesting fossil of an African fish that appeared to breathe. And they think that it was actually one of the first sets, evolutionarily, of lungs anywhere on the planet. This huge finding, this fish that would actually come to the surface and breathe. And it was amazing, and I was completely enraptured for 2 hours talking to her. And then on the drive home, I realized, wow, biology is so advanced, and so many of the fundamental findings are years behind, that if you want to have a fundamental finding, you need to luck out and find a rare fossil of an extinct African fish who breathes in an interesting way, right? And I was like, wow, I feel really lucky in the world of the internet and computing, because we're in the first 10 to 20 years. And it's like biology in the 1500s, right? There's still lots of interesting observations. There's still lots of change. You're not going to have the microscope for another 200 years, right? But there's a lot of really big and landscape-changing things that can happen at this point, and there's still a lot of interesting advances that can happen. And I think the same thing is true when you look at digital businesses. And so when you look at digital media, what happens with television, what happens with video, I actually think that a lot of what happens on the internet is going to be purely additive to the overall television and video experience as we know it today in movie theaters and in television sets. Just like a lot of biology can actually be just physically observed and noticed, and then the microscope adds an entirely different layer of observation. And I think that the internet is sort of the same way. And right now, I'll be honest, I don't think we have it right. I don't think we know how to take this digital content and make it a really effective medium online. But I do think it's really important that we be experimenting with it, because the microscope is coming, right? The thing that really is the landscape-changing way that people consume content online will happen. And I do think when you think about things like YouTube and you think about TiVo, whether or not those inventions are going to be good or useful or stand the test of time has yet to be seen. But there does seem to be a couple of fundamental cores in those products that are interesting and have some truth to them. So in YouTube, I really think the big insight is variable length programming. Right? So as people are able to consume content digitally, they could consume it at any point in the day, right? And it may not necessarily be the case that they want to devote an hour or they want to devote 30 minutes. They may want to devote 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 22 minutes. And that really the length should fit the story of content. What's bad about YouTube is a lot of the content is really amateur, and sometimes that's really good, and sometimes that's really bad, right? And so when you look at, I actually think that that the studios have a lot more to offer in terms of professionally told, directed, acted, and produced stories, and in many ways are a lot more compelling. If you can imagine variable length programming of that format, it could be something that's really compelling. And so I think the variable length format of YouTube and the idea that once people have digital media, they're going to want to consume it in variable length is a truism. And I think that ultimately the advance of less people consume it, more efficiently in the digital means is through that variable length programming. And with TiVo, I think the idea that you can basically construct your own channel and your own programming is what's really interesting and effective about it. The idea that you don't have to watch shows that you don't like, and it doesn't matter necessarily what particular network is currently being aired on. The fact that you can just take the shows that you like and stitch them together is a really compelling concept. But it lacks basic portability. Right? So you're tied to your particular TiVo. Sometimes your TiVo misses a particular show because there was a conflict and you didn't realize it. And there's some annoying elements to TiVo. But if you take a TiVo and YouTube and start talking about professionally produced content of variable length, where you could actually have a channel that's programmed for you and your likes and dislikes, that end is portable. Maybe you can watch it on an iPod, maybe you can watch it on your laptop, maybe you can watch it on the screen above the treadmill at the gym, or at television at home. Then you start talking about something that's really richly compelling and consuming. And I think a lot of what's happening today has elements that are right, but they aren't quite right. I went out to dinner with Jeremy Legg and a few of the other folks here from Turner last night. And my basic observation was, he said, well, look, the problem is that people don't like to buy content online. And I said, it's true, my TiVo is my first stop, but that's because I already have the medium. I don't have to worry about downloading all those shows. So sure, if my TiVo managed to capture my favorite television show, I'm going to go watch it there. But if I missed it, I will download it. But I said, but then the problem is, I end up in this horrible situation where the portability really kills me. Right? So I do think people will pay for content online. I do think that the download speed is a problem, and the lack of portability is a problem. Because for me, what will happen is, the classic thing happens. It's Friday night in my apartment, and they say that now and more in the 25 to 35-year-old zone, people have this two-screen viewing experience where they'll be sitting there watching television with their laptop on their lap. So doing email or playing around on Facebook, and you're nodding like you all do this, right? Like, this is what I do, right? So I come home and I'm like, oh no, like the TiVo screwed up. I don't have Grays, I don't have this. So I go and I start downloading all the shows from iTunes. I have to let them get a little ahead, right? So I let them download in the background while I do email. And then, now I've got Grays on my laptop. And I've got to make a decision. Do I watch Grays full screen on my laptop? Or do I watch it in the little window on the side of my email? Right, or do I just do email? Because I used to be able to do email and watch Grays, but now I have to make a choice. And so I do think that there's a kernel, there's a bunch of kernels of truth here in terms of variable length programming, being able to have the exact shows you want, when you want them, pre-downloaded, and also an element of portability that's really important. But the lack of choice in some of these cases is really, I think, what's hindering a medium, right? So I said, it's interesting because if you looked at my overall behavior, you'd say, well, wow, she doesn't watch that much content on her computer, which is probably true, but that's because my computer's for email and for surfing the web and a whole bunch of other things I want to be doing concurrently. So, but if you could use my laptop as a way of downloading the computer and then port it over very easily on a USB stick or something else to be able to watch it on my television, I'd be a really happy camper. And I think in these early stages, there's going to be a lot of experimentation. What works here in terms of how people want to consume content. And then, of course, there's the monetization piece of it. Is it going to be, pay as you go? Is it going to be an all-you-can-eat subscription? Is it going to be advertising-based? Is it going to be a combination of all three? And obviously, with YouTube and with various partnerships we have with you and with other people, we're doing experiments to try and understand how these online video formats and these variable length formats best monetize.
With this explosion of video content that we're going to see online, we're already seeing it, and over the next 10 years, it's going to be even more so. Search becomes so important for video. How do you see online video search evolving?
Sure. Well, there's a bunch of different things that I think will happen, and I've alluded to I think one of them earlier. So in video search right now, search engines are still really basic and remedial. We're still almost entirely based on text. There's a goal and a hope that at some point you could give someone a picture, you could give a search engine a picture and say, find all videos with this person in it. But that level of face recognition is you know, in my opinion, a decade or more away. I met last month at a company called at TechCrunch 40, where they had taken 40 startups. There was a startup that literally evolved off of 3 decades of academic research around could they take a picture and find it in a video. And they're just starting to have moderate success, but they're limiting the pictures only to celebrities and the film only to news. So it's a pretty well understood format in both cases, and you don't have a lot of people who necessarily look a lot like each other that you're looking for and things like that. So I think search by picture and video or search for a particular object, that's much further out. What is very likely to happen is us being able to have a really great speech-to-text model or great speech-to-text models existing such that you could pull closed captions out of all videos, amateur, professional, and otherwise, and be able to search for specific mentions. So the information you're looking for doesn't have to exist in the tags for that video, or it doesn't have to exist in the meta description. Because right now those are crutches. We hope that in the case of professional content, we're getting a meta description. We're really happy when we get closed caption because that means we can actually search over things. But really, meta tags, the tags that users add on YouTube, are a crutch. We're hoping that, you know, if someone will, you know, realize, like, if there's a monkey in the picture, that they'll write the word monkey there, right? Like, or if there's a, you know, if there's a swimming pool, they'll mention the word pool in case the content producer forgot to mention it in the meta description. So it's really a crutch to try and get us over this. But once we have really great speech to text, that will capture a lot of instances of words, people talking about the pool or people talking about the monkey, and then ultimately being able to search for that. So I really think that that's where the big breakthrough is going to happen in video search in the next 5 years or so. I think longer term, we'll have things like face recognition and or object recognition, scene descriptions, things like that.
A few lighter questions, then we'll go to Q&A. So what are a few of the websites that you visit daily?
Well, that's a good question. So there's a bunch of different websites that obviously I use Google a lot. I like iGoogle, our personalized homepage. So I have, you know, sort of my little set of widgets that I'll click off to there. I read a lot of industry blogs. So I read things like Boomtown that are on the tech industry, Technorati, and others. I have a favorite game site that plays a little card game that I like called Lost Cities. So I go and use a site called Flex Games. And I also am a really avid Facebook user. So, you know, I'm up there on Facebook, you know, just trying to understand and think about how people interact, you know, using the message boards, playing Scrabble, doing other silly things. But I think that Facebook has a really interesting and compelling model around these applications, these sort of little nuggets of content that can interact really in interesting ways on your profile page.
Well, social networks, what is your view? Do you think that they're a fad? Do you think that they're sustainable as a business? And what are some of the things you've learned about social networking by participating in it?
Sure. So I think that a couple of observations, because I think that you know, my view on social networks is somewhat different than a lot of the industry. So I think of social networks kind of like coffee shops. People go where their friends are, right? You hear where your friends are in terms of they're on this network or that network, and that tends to be where you sign up. And so interesting things happen. Like you sort of get into a rut with your friends where you'll go to the same coffee shop all the time. That's your coffee shop. But occasionally new coffee shops open up down the road. And I really do think that, well, you know, yes, there's some stickiness. There's also an element of people wanting to try new things. That's why we've seen things like Friendster and then the rise of MySpace and now the rise of Facebook. That's one reason you see this sort of fad-like behavior because, you know, the new coffee shop opens up down the block, people go and check it out, and if the couches are more comfortable and or they have better coffee, right, like you might stay over there, or you might decide, no, I don't like this, it's too shishi, we're going back over there where it's comfortable, right, like, you know, but, you know, people sort of, you know, make those kinds of observations, and they do move around more than most think in terms of social networks. And it's possible that, you know, in any given case, that social network will become the Starbucks, right, the mainstay that everyone uses, and there'll also be some niche providers around. That might be Facebook, that might be something in the future. But I do think that there are fundamentally useful things that can be built on top of social networks. So for example, personalized search I think is one of the big waves of the future for search. And so being able to understand more of the context around a person, where they are from things like status messages, who their friends are, what their friends like, pulling together friends' recommendations. You know, we often say, you know, interestingly, travel spam on Google, spam as sort of polluted results is awful. So if you ever try and search for something like hotels in Berlin, like good luck, right? There's so many different travel operators trying to get your reservation. To get a really good site on hotels in Berlin is actually really hard. So a lot of people end up just turning to their friends and saying, what hotels have you stayed in Berlin? Which ones do you look like? And or they'll say, which magazines and recommendations do you rely on? Do you like Frommer's, or do you like Condé Nast Traveler or Travel and Leisure? And they sort of fish around. So I actually think mining recommendations from your friends will be really interesting. And I actually think that one of the killer applications that will happen is going to be some blend of social networking and cell phones. And it's happening already. There's a lot of interesting things happening in Japan, whereby which friends will meet up using their cell phone. So, your cell phone understands who you're friends with and what their cell phone numbers are. And if you have good GPS technology in your cell phone, it can actually tell you when your friends are nearby. Like, hey, you're walking past this coffee shop and your friend is sitting inside, right? Or like I had this good friend who every year we try and arrange the opportunity to ski together. And every year Jamie and I meet up in April, compare notes on where we went skiing that winter, and we're like, you know what? March 21st and 22nd, we were both in the back bowls at Vail, and we never even knew it, right? We were all bundled up, we're in a lift line, we don't know what the other one looks like. We could have been standing right next to each other and not known it. And wouldn't it have been nice if our cell phones had buzzed and said, like, Jamie's here, Marissa's here, right? I noticed this actually just the other day on Facebook, because two of my really good friends, and I actually thought they'd gone there together, both set their status messages to say that they were in Vegas for the weekend. And when Derek came back, I said to him, hey Derek, were you there with Sonia and Douglas? And he was like, no, they were in Vegas, right? And I was like, oh, it was totally obvious looking at the status page that you guys were in the same place. But if your cell phones actually know it and let you know that, that would be, I think, something that ultimately is really intriguing. And obviously, you have to have a lot of privacy controls on when do you want your location to be known and when do you not want it to be known. That control has to be in the hands of the users. But I think that is coming. I think there's actually a whole bunch of interesting social trends, just in terms of other funny things on the whole element of user control that are coming up, which is, I do think there's going to be an entirely new notion of privacy that evolves off of social networking. There's some notions that say that basically email is on the decline in favor of messaging. And I do think, interestingly enough, the new generation that's sort of coming up using social networking has a totally different notion of privacy. So I really like my associate's program because they keep me young, because I'm constantly sort of having these kids who are right out of college. And one of the women who works for me the other day walked into my office and said, the guy that I'm dating disabled his wall. Isn't that sketch? And I looked up at my computer for a second, because it took me a moment to actually parse what she was even talking about. And I realized that she was talking about the wall on Facebook. And the wall is where you can just post something. So anybody who goes to your profile page can see what your friends have posted there. And so this guy she's dating has disabled her wall, and I had to think why would someone disable their wall? Why wouldn't you want to have a bulletin board where everyone can just come and write what they want to write? And it's oh, because you don't want other people to see what they're writing to you, which probably means you're seeing multiple people. So I was like, that is sketch, you're right. It took me that whole brain pattern being wall, Facebook, disabled, oh right, interesting. But but it's interesting. But what I thought was really profound about it is that users' attempt for privacy in this new age world where so much is known about you and your status is known and you're being so much more open with all of that information, attempts at privacy are sometimes seen as nefarious. Yeah, right? Him disabling his wall was sketch. That was Jessica's conclusion. I actually think she was right, but
that is just so sketch. Questions? Yes.
I'm wondering, you're talking a lot about time management and content, and I'm wondering if Google has any plans for some sort of universal calendar program that would allow people to manage their personal time and also access the content and social networking that they're trying to do.
Sure. So what we have right now is we have Google Calendar, which interfaces really nicely with things like Gmail. So someone emails you and says, dinner 6:30 Thursday. And actually, sometimes we'll even parse that out and say, do you want to put this on your calendar? And so, Calendar complements email really nicely. I do think over time, all of our applications. So when I talk about there's sort of three core areas of Google. There's search, there's ads, and there's applications. Applications are things like Gmail, Calendar, Docs, and spreadsheets. All of those are being built on a unified sharing model, where, so for example, I My mother always wants to know where I am, and like, you know, I'm pretty good about mailing her itineraries, and she knows I'm in Atlanta right now, for example. But the other thing that I did was I was like, you know what, I'll just share my calendar with my mother, because there's very little on it that I don't want her to know about. So she actually can just log on and like look at my calendar, and it's visible alongside of her own, so she can see, you know, when we have conflicts and how the different time zones and things match up. So there is a basic sharing model. So you know, we have the basic calendar functionality, we have a basic sharing model. Taking that and combining it with content consumption, I think, is the really interesting piece. And as I said, like when I was talking before about variable length programming, what you really want to do is, I was thinking the other day, I'm working a little bit on Google Health now, we were talking about wellness campaigns. And you know, for me, when I like get on the treadmill at night, my issue is I just hate sitting there just watching the miles tick by and watching the minutes tick by and thinking 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes. And so it's great. I just moved into a house and I actually have like my treadmill right in front of my TV with a TiVo underneath. So I can go through the commercials, right? Like, it's great. But what I really would love is just like, you know, 37 minutes or however long it takes me to, you know, run 4 miles and, you know, like, and of that much content to watch that keeps me completely entertained, so I'm distracted from sort of all of the time metrics. And so if you could imagine taking really well-produced content, my personal preference is baking those together and then saying, okay, here's 37 minutes of content. You can stick it on a USB drive and watch it on your television, you can watch it on your iPod, you can go out jogging with it. Like, that would be a really amazing advance. I do think when you start talking about social networking to understand the preferences, calendar to overall understand these blocks of time, how variable they are and how much content is needed, that's really where you start talking about some great applications that could come together in terms of how to amalgamate content from both the professional side and the amateur side together into a really interesting block of content that could be useful and portable.
I have a couple questions for you, actually. One is, what big ideas, from a Google perspective, big ideas, have ended up on the cutting room floor, and maybe why? Maybe they've gone through ideation and development pretty far through, and still end up on the cutting room floor. Why? And the second question is, with respect to the search engine, you know, there's entire industries have spawned around trying to crack the page ranking algorithm for down the secret. But how do you guys maintain that for us to do that? It's like the recipe for code. How do you keep that together?
Well, the cutting room floor is interesting. We say never, and so I can't really talk a lot about the products that we've cut because I think in many cases they're still not out of the side of the realm of possibilities, and so I can't really tip our hand on the types of things that we've talked about. But it does bring me to one, I think, of the core philosophies that we've overall viewed, which is don't kill projects, morph them. Because we really do feel that when you have a bunch of talented employees who are really empowered, really creative, and they get reasonably far along on something, there's usually a kernel of truth, right? There's something there that's really interesting and compelling, and probably the product can be sort of swung around in a different direction while still maintaining that core idea. And so, you know, you sort of look at what's great about a product and then what needs to change about a product, right? So, I mean, like, when I think about the Google News, the clustering is what's great. There's a whole bunch of different ways we could present it. There's a whole bunch of different strategies we could have around the content and how it gets aggregated. But the clusters themselves are what's the really unique advantage. Gmail, it's like size, speed, and search are what we originally said. We wanted Gmail to be super fast. We wanted to give people lots of size in terms of the overall size they had for storage. And we wanted to let them organize through search. And, you know, but that said, if you say, okay, like we're building a mail client that's all about size, speed, and search, you know, there's still a lot of degrees of freedom in there. So we tend to say, don't kill a project, morph it. And so a lot of things that get cut could come back to life, and or a lot of things that are out there right now that are, you know, maybe floundering a little, we ultimately really want to reposition, because we do think that usually things that make it that far have some merit to them and are worth saving. And as to the SEO industry, so there's a whole industry around search engine optimization. How can you get to be #1 on Google without buying an ad for the searches that you want to end up on #1 for? And so we really think that it turns out there's sort of two elements of this industry: white hat and black hat. So there are people who will come and market really services that in essence are designed to trick the search engine. And we think that's bad for the search engine. We also think that's bad for users in terms of the overall user experience. So for example, one of the common practices of black hat SEOs is that they'll come and market something called cloaking. Like we'll optimize your site for Google. Because what happens is when your browser contacts a website, it tells the website what kind of client you're using. Are you using Internet Explorer on a PC? Are you using Safari on a Mac? And interestingly, when we send the crawler out, when Harry sends the crawler out, and now our whole team of Spider-Men send the crawlers out, the thing that contacts the website actually declares itself as Googlebot. We don't say we're IE, we don't say we're Firefox, like we actually tell it like we're Googlebot. So it's possible, if you want to be clever, to say, oh, Googlebot has come to visit us. I want to give this special piece of content to Googlebot that's different than what you give the user that comes the next second on IE. And we actually think that's really bad for end users. Because as a result, this is what sometimes you'll see a result on Google, and when you click through to it, you're like, this page isn't at all what the search result page said it was going to be. And when I click through, like that content isn't there at all. That happens due to cloaking, generally speaking. And for us, we can provide high quality search results because we know what the pages say. So if there's a website owner out there who's now telling us something different that the pages don't say when you go to them, that hurts the search results and ultimately hurts the user experience. And that's when you have these really disappointing moments where you're like, wait, this isn't what it said it would be. So we don't like cloaking, so we don't like black hat SEOs. And we do things like, as we discover black hat practices, we will penalize sites in the results. So basically, we'll take away the boost they got from that. So we'll do things like, we'll check the site using Internet Explorer as the user agent and see if we got the same thing, and then ultimately re-rank them. We don't take them out of the results, but we re-rank them to where they should be as if we had visited with Internet Explorer. For white hat SEOs, we actually don't have any negative repercussions at all. So we just think that white hat SEOs generally will go and meet with webmasters and say, this is how you build a good website. And it turns out websites that are good for users are also good for search engines. And they'll give great, very simple advice, like put a title on the web page. So most people forget to title the web pages. I know that sounds silly, because what happens is like when you're looking at a web page, there's the frame that you're looking at, and there's usually a big header in there. And interestingly, in HTML languages, that's called a header, right? The title actually appears in the blue bar up at the top of your browser Chrome. And sometimes people forget to actually title their pages. So sometimes they look up there and it says untitled. Right, so just doing things like titling your pages, having a really good, robust link structure to your website so all pages are findable. Because if people can't click to your website, remember how I told you earlier how the crawler goes out by getting pages and then following the links on those pages? If you create a page and it's not linked from anywhere, we're never going to find it, right? And neither are any users, right? So doing basic things like that are things that white hat SEOs will sort of come, they'll do an analysis of your site and they'll tell you how to improve on those metrics. And I do think that's actually an important service, and it's a very positive service in terms of the overall search engine and user experience piece.
I'm told that we have time for one more question. Who has the most urgent, the most pressing question that must be asked?
Here we go. Right back here.
Back here.
I don't know that mine is the most urgent, but I'm the lucky guy. Just thinking about the Google model of releasing early and often, I'm wondering what kind of processes you have to sort of ferret out ideas that maybe need to be baked a little bit more versus ideas that just aren't working out. What kind of reviews processes you have for that?
Sure. So we have two sets of review processes that I think are, well, actually, I'll cite three of them. That said, a lot of it is just a vibe. Like sometimes you can just tell, like, what, the core of the product is there, and we can fill out the details, like sort by date later. So sometimes you'll feel that. But there's three core processes that my team is involved with. One is a user interface review. So as product managers basically are producers in the internet and technology side of the world. So we'll bring things into a user interface review very early in their ideation phase. What should the flow through for the users be? How should it generally work and look? And then we'll also come back for a final review, which is much more fit and finish review. Is everything in sentence case? Is it left aligned? Is it the right color? Right, like sort of all of those finer details. And we'll do a sort of a polished process like that, which is our user interface review process, We also generally have what we call GPS reviews, Google Product Strategy Reviews, where we meet with Larry, Sergey, and Eric, or whatever combination of the three of them is on campus that week, and we'll go through a launch review where we'll say, this is a product. You know, Eric has basically said, which I think is the right policy to have, that if we're going to present something to an end Google user, he wants to know about it, and he wants to have seen it first, which as the CEO is a reasonable request. It may not be possible in terms of producing content and the amount of content that gets produced out of a company like Time Warner, but for like a product that you use where there's a user flow, people should be able to come and say, you know, hey, you know, here's the 5-minute demo of how this works, and show that. So we generally go through a GPS review and get a green light or a red light in terms of the yay or nay. And then we also have what we call a launch calendar process, which is a pretty lightweight process. So if you want to launch your product, you go and add it to a wiki-style web page. And so you can just say, like, I want to launch a product, and you get a line item in sort of in a grid. You can say, this is what I'm launching, here's my contact information, this is the day that I want to launch. And there's actually what we call a bunch of approval and advisor bits that live there as part of the launch calendar process. And what's nice is it can all kind of happen in an automated fashion, even offline. So that entry on the launch calendar basically notifies a bunch of different departments. Notifies legal, it notifies PR, it notifies user support, the people who are going to be answering emails, notifies product management so that we need to look over the user interface piece and that we probably need to do a launch review. So it notifies all those different departments, and then they can do what's necessary to support the launch, and then when they're ready, they can actually flip their bit to OK, and then you can launch once all of your bits are set to OK. So those are just some of the general policies that we have around trying to make it easier to launch things, but while still making it the case that we know we think that we've launched something that we can be proud of.
Okay, that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank Marissa Mayer from Google.
Both Marissa and David, and thank you all for coming out today.